The city of Portland, like any other major American city, has seen its share of fires. The greatest of these being in August 1873, when a single fire destroyed more than 20 city blocks. This was predated by another waterfront fire in 1872 that destroyed a few blocks as well. The most deadly fire happened in the summer of 1975 when a stairwell at the Flophouse Pomona Hotel on Skid Row was set ablaze. In 1964, the beloved Forestry Center in northwest Portland burned in an infamous inferno that even affected the Montgomery Park building across the street. Numerous commercial and warehouse fires have happened in the city since 1950, with a 2019 Oregonian piece being done about the city's most catastrophic fires, beginning with those in the 50s. But there had obviously been fires before then. And the thing is, for all the worst of the worst conflagrations a city can experience, they almost always start the same way. One spot, fuel, and a spark. Given the circumstances, any fire can become cataclysmic if not spotted and stopped fast enough. Any single fire can be that one that changes history. And imagine it not being one fire, but possibly hundreds. Starting in the fall of 1938, something started happening in the city of Portland. In a year where fire damage was down and the local fire department was optimistic it would be a good year overall, things were suddenly turned on their side. And not just in 1938, but going into the next year. Get ready, 'cause out of the gate, we're going to be talking about a lot of fires. Okay. October 29th, 1938. The recently vacated Miles building at the corner of Southwest Front and Pine. A pile of old papers were piled up and set ablaze on the second floor of this building, causing some damage. But there was not too much concern, as the building was to be torn down a short while later. November 1st, 1938. The Manchester Building, once standing at the southwest corner of 5th and Oak in downtown, also had a fire set on its second floor. The method by which the fire was started was never mentioned. November 9th, 1938. Reportedly, there were 2 fires on this night, started in 2 different ways, a marked shift in how they were done. Like at least one before, a fire was set using a pile of papers that were placed in a closet on the 3rd floor of the Governor Building at Southwest 2nd and Harvey Milk, formerly Stark. The fire ultimately caused damage on multiple floors and took 2 hours to put out. Then the shift, also reportedly happening on the night of November 9th, a fire was set at a warehouse in northwest Portland where NATO and 18th meet today. The building is still here, and this fire was specifically set by using what was referred to as oily waste obtained from boxcars in railroad yards. The use of this oily waste as a fire starter would become something the fire department would frequently encounter over the next year. November 20th, 1938. Down near the foot of Mill Street, on the west side of the Willamette River, oily waste was ignited in a small nook space alongside the Leighton Cooperage Company's building. Minimum damage was reported. Now, the Leighton Cooperage Company. Now, they had an interesting address. Their address was 0208 Southwest Mill. So when the renumbering happened in 1933, all the streets that were between Front and the river down here, because eventually it gets further away from the river, because this was kind of the starting point, this was 0, first block that way is 100, they added a 0. So like one block that way would be like 0100 instead of just 100. So Mill Street, if it still went through here, would be coming out right here. There's still a light for it as there's a path in there. So Layton was at 0208, so it would have been just over 2 blocks that direction. You can see there's a lot of stuff right there. But fortunately for us, at least for a moment, here's where Mill would have come out. And there's this little, I guess, kind of viewpointy thing. Really don't know exactly what it's here for, but yeah. I mean, that's about a block, so pretty much where this building is back here, it would have been generally in that area. And that's where the fire would have happened at the Layton Cooperage Company on November 20th, 1938. November 25th, 1938. A small fire was set near a back door into the basement of the aging and soon-to-be demolished Atkinson School at Northeast 12th and Cooch. November 28th, 1938. An isolated building connected to the Western Foundry Company at Southwest Water and Carruthers caught fire and went up fast, destroyed in less than 20 minutes. With the cost, specifically of this fire, the Portland Fire Department, again on pace to have less fire damage than in 1937 and most previous years, found itself surpassing the previous year, and it was only going to get worse. November 30th, 1938. A building on First Avenue between Oak and Pine, the site of Honey Press, caught fire shortly before 9 p.m. It started on the second floor and shot up an elevator shaft, doing further damage on the third floor. Despite being under control in only 20 minutes, the fire would end up doing $25,000 in damage. And again, this is 1938 numbers. December 4th, 1938. Oily waste was used to set a small fire outside the General Paint Company on Northeast Irving Street, just off 12th Avenue, near Sullivan's Gulch. December 7th, 1938. Oily waste was again used to start a fire, this time at the Comfort Fuel Company, located at 13th and Pettygrove. Considering it was a fuel company, this one was fortunately put out fast, causing minimal damage. December 10th, 1938. Down by the river from where the Rose Quarter is today, formerly the foot of Holiday Street, a massive warehouse fire broke out on the waterfront, a place run by Globe Mills based out of Los Angeles. Being a grain warehouse, the fire spread fast, destroying 20,000 bushels of grain and causing roughly the same amount of damage in a monetary sense, $200,000. The fire was so large that 20 different fire companies had to rush to the scene to battle it, and several firefighters were injured while fighting the blaze. While substantially worse than those before it, this fire marked the end of this shocking string of fires, all of which were incendiary in nature. It stopped for 17 days. And then it came back strong on December 27th, 1938, with 2 fires happening less than 10 blocks apart. At 7:22 p.m., a fire was noticed coming from a storage shed at the site of the Great Northern Casket Company, near present-day Macadam and Gaines Street. The fire destroyed the shed at a total cost of $8,000. Only about an hour later, around 8:30 p.m., A fire was discovered at the Portland Box and Lumber Company, located near South Water Avenue and Arthur Street. This proved to be a particularly difficult fire to take on, causing $6,500 in damage when all was said and done. It was noted in papers that this fire had happened only a couple blocks from where the Western Foundry fire happened.
It's interesting because these were seemed kind of scattered, because there was a fire that happened right here. There was another fire that happened only 2 blocks down this way. If this on-ramp in front of me wasn't here, I'd be able to see the other location perfectly. So just 2 blocks apart in this same area that's a lot different looking than it was back in the late 30s. And yet these fires happened like a month apart. So it wasn't like, you think one would start one here, they'd come down here and start another one, they do it the same night, if these are all connected somehow. But they were 2 blocks apart, but happened a month apart.
This night of 2 blazes was something of a farewell, a going out with a bang. While the city of Portland openly acknowledged by this time that they had an active firebug in their midst, the fires stopped again. No fires all through January 1939. For a moment, there were a few breaths of relief. Perhaps February would be just like January. February 1st, 1939. A fire broke out at the Edwards Wire and Rope Company near Northwest 26th and Nikolai. The fire would do $1,000 damage, and it was noted the building had been broken into and ransacked, leading to the conclusion that the fire had been done to cover up the theft. February 2nd, 1939, a vacant building at the northwest corner of Front and Morrison caught fire and was put out before doing much damage. February 4th, 1939, while most fires before this were started in the evening, at 7 a.m. on this day, a fire broke out at the old Portland Cordage Company building, a large structure filling up most of a city block. And another fire that was felt started to cover up a robbery. The fire was set on the 3rd floor of the building, but spread to other floors throughout the building through its elevator. The smoke was so thick that several firefighters passed out, overwhelmed by the smoke. In the end, $8,500 in damage was done. Another fire would happen on this same night at a Union Pacific oil house in the Albina Rail Yards near where the foot of Knott Street once went down by the Willamette River. February 6, 1939, a fire was set doing $300 damage at the Oregon Door Company building located at the foot of Umatilla Street in the Selwood neighborhood. This fire was somewhat distant from the focal area where these other fires had been done, but it had also been started the same way. Oily boxcar waste. February 7th, 1939, around 10 p.m., a passerby in a car noticed a fire had started at the Portland Spar Company, located at Macadam and Bancroft, only a couple blocks from where the Great Northern Casket Fire had happened. Planks of wood had been removed from the building's wall, allowing the arsonists entry, wherein they set a fire to the beams underneath the ground floor. Because it was seen early on, it was also caught early. 5 fires had been set in a week, and it wasn't done. February 8th, 1939. The night after the Portland Spar fire, the business directly next to it, the Pacific Honey Company, was set on fire with a pile of waste lit up against one of the building's walls. At close to the same time as this, across the river in southeast Portland, a fire was set at the Southern Pacific Car Shops at 21st and Holgate. While thought possibly connected, With the fires starting close to the same time, there was no way the same individual or individuals could have been responsible for both. And while the many fires before these yielded no solid clues as to who could have been responsible, on this night, a possible lead. Shortly after the Pacific Honey Fire started, only 2 blocks away at where Hood and Lowell once intersected, a man named R.C. Smith had an encounter with a breathless young man who'd clearly been running, possibly from something. This man, described as being about 20 years old, 5'9", 145 pounds, wearing a felt hat and trench coat, asked Smith if a fire was happening nearby. When Smith affirmed this, the man continued running. So is it possible then that a young man around the age of 20 was involved in all these fires? February 12, 1939. Waste was set on fire beneath the dock of a building run by the Kerr Gifford Company at the foot of North Skidmore Street. The fire only smoldered, however, never quite getting above deck level and thus causing no damage to the building itself. A man was seen acting in a suspicious manner near this location prior to the fire, but it appears nothing else was learned of this individual. And another cooling off period. For 10 days. February 22, 1939. The old Portland Commons building, just north of the Burnside Bridge along Front Avenue, was set on fire, causing about $300 damage. February 28, 1939, a pile of oily waste was set on fire at the back door of the E.V. Prentice machine shop at the end of North Randolph Street next to the Albina rail yards. This fire only caused $100 damage. March 2, 1939. Access was gained into the basement of the Spaulding Building Materials Company at Southeast 1st and Taylor. The fire was found made up of combustibles in an elevator shaft. And then the fires stopped for the better part of almost 5 months, with one exception, that being a fire that was set down in Mock's Crest in North Portland when a pile of flammable items were set on fire by the long railroad tunnel that runs under the Portsmouth neighborhood. But other than that, months passed with no fires, leading locals to at least hope this was finally over. August 20th, 1939. On Front Avenue, just south of Market Street, the site of the Goldberg Brothers Dried Fruit Company, oily waste was piled against the back wall of the building and set on fire. Flames quickly climbed up a stairwell, reaching the roof before firefighters arrived. It was actually the second fire at this location in as many years. September 1st, 1939. Down by the river on its east side, along Ash Street, oily waste was placed under the building where the General Grocery Company was located. Down by the river, their building was elevated on a dock, and this is where the fire was started. Fortunately, the building had a sprinkler system which took care of the fire. September 6, 1939. A fire was set at the Douglas Sales Agency located near 31st and Multnomah Street. Oily waste was placed under the floor on both sides of the building before 2 different fires were set. One of these set off the building's sprinkler system, which also set off a fire alarm. Firefighters arrived quickly and the building experienced only $50 in damage. October 2nd, 1939. Another day with multiple fires. First discovered around 8 p.m., a fire was set on the 3rd floor of Union Station, then more often referred to as the Union Depot. The fire took 2 hours to get under control, causing $8,000 in damage and destroying records held there for the station. It was checked to see if the fire may have been caused by defective wiring, and in the end it was deemed most likely the fire was intentionally set. Hours after this, around 2 a.m., a fire was set at a building on Albina and Interstate in North Portland. The fire was set on the first floor, and before it was contained, it spread to the building next to it, where a luggage company was located. Altogether, this fire caused $10,000 damage. And then all went quiet again. 28 fires, unsolved, in less than a year. And while most of the fires were caught quick with little damage caused, like I inferred at the start of this, with each fire one sets, there's the potential to cause massive damage, change lives, ruin businesses, leave a populace in fear. The city of Portland had never experienced such a run of arson like this. In fact, most cities hadn't. And after these last 2 fires in early October 1939, the local authorities were nowhere near solving them. There had been a sighting or two of possible suspects. At least one person was questioned on one of the fires, but that person was later released when they provided an alibi. With whoever was responsible for all of this still out there, locals had to wonder who they were, where they were, and when they might come back again. But as you might have wondered to this point, Portland, and even Oregon for that matter, were not the only places experiencing an uptick in intentional fires. In particular, in 1939, similar fires started happening around Washington, many of which were set using oily waste from boxcars. On the night of October 30th, 1939, a fire was set in a storage shed at a lumber business in Hoquiam, Washington. Another fire that was fortunately caught quick. When the scene was investigated, a distinct boot print was found and a cast was taken of it in the hopes it came from whoever was responsible. The following night, a warehouse in neighboring Aberdeen, Washington was set on fire. Again, it was caught quick, and again a matching distinct boot print was found. These fires were, no doubt, the work of the same people. On November 1st, the following day, the Aberdeen fire chief had a strange encounter. 2 men entered the fire hall. They both appeared to be transients, one middle-aged and one fairly young. A father and son, so they said. They seemed on edge and were fiercely interested in finding out how the fire department put out the fire the night before so quickly. Nothing suspicious about that. The older man tried to pass it off as just something that interested him, as he grew up in Rochester, New York, next to a fire station. The experience was strange, but the men eventually left. It was then recalled that much earlier, March 1938, 2 men matching the description of these 2 had been questioned in relation to a fire in Tacoma, Washington, not far away. When appearing at the Aberdeen Fire Hall, the men identified themselves as Fred and Robert Walzer, Fred being the father and Robert being the son. It just so happened the 2 men questioned back in March of 1938 were also named Fred and Robert. The younger one was Robert Walzer, 22 years old, from Rome, New York. The older one was named Fred Stine, 47 years old, from Rochester, New York. This was too much of a coincidence, and the word was spread around Western Washington to look out for these guys. It turned out Even by this time, Walzer and Stine were known to frequent the Tacoma area, often living out of whatever empty boxcars they could find. Eventually, a boxcar in Tacoma was found to be where they'd recently been staying, and inside was a mess of oily waste, apparently sitting there to be used later. The two men were also known to frequent the local YMCA when they needed a shower or a shave, and the local library, just as a place to get them off the street for a while. Local law enforcement went looking for them and found Walzer at the YMCA and Stine at the library. And Stine just happened to be wearing an interesting pair of boots when he was arrested. Their arrest would take place on November 6th, 1939, and by this point they'd committed at least 2 more fires, one of which was at a Catholic school. Reportedly, several nuns were rousted from their beds, barely escaping in time. And these 2 men would be grilled for nearly a week, with neither individual willing to admit to any arson work. The boots Stine wore were a perfect match for the cast they took at the Hoquiam fire site, but still, arson was a tough charge to take to court, and they weren't getting any cooperation from these transients. Until, perhaps exhausted, perhaps seeing things as futile, or even possibly seeing a chance to get a lighter punishment, the 22-year-old Robert Walzer suddenly started to talk. The 2 men were primarily being grilled for the July 25, 1939 burning of the Palmer Lumber and Manufacturing Company in Chehalis, Washington. Destroying a town block, for a time it was concerned the fire might spread and destroy the whole downtown area. Altogether, the fire led to more than $200,000 worth of damage. Fred Stine begrudgingly admitted to being involved in the Palmer lumber fire, but that was it. Walzer had a different story. Out of nowhere and with little emotion, he admitted to being responsible for at least 47 different fires. Walzer and Stine had met in 1934 in a small town in Montana. Both originally from New York, they both had their own troubled pasts, although nothing too terrible. Walzer would make headlines in 1932 as a kid who ran away so frequently that when he went missing, the police actively stopped searching for him, knowing he'd turn up at some point. And he would. The much older Stine had only completed school up to the 7th grade before eventually getting work in the railroad business. He'd also reportedly served time in a prison in West Virginia. But by the time he met Walzer, he'd been out of work for years and had a less than positive outlook on life and the world around him. Due to their age difference, they were easily able to pass as father and son, a dynamic that some newspapers, without getting into detail, claimed they used to a dysfunctional and sexual level. Something tells me I don't even want to know what that was supposed to mean. Walzer painted Stine as the leader, the one who set the fires while he stood back and watched, sometimes even whistling to the tune of "Whistle While You Work." Perhaps this was just Walzer trying to get a lesser punishment, but it may have been the truth. Stine was definitely the angrier and more aggressive of the two. Walzer just seemed to be along for the ride, while sharing in some of Stine's criticisms of the world. Investigators would describe Fred Stine as one of the most bitter, hateful people they'd ever met. At this time, Walzer would say they started setting fires in 1938 as they ventured through the Pacific Northwest, stating, We were sore at everybody. We just wanted to get even with the world. It was even said that Stine had a particular hatred for unions, and a lot of these incendiary fires, set at mills and warehouses, involved businesses with unionized workers. Before even being asked about how they set their fires, Walzer admitted they most often obtained waste from boxcars to spark their blazes. While Stine held firm that he had only been involved in one fire, it didn't help him much, as that was the one fire both he and Walzer would be charged with, even though they had clearly been involved in others. The men would be abruptly convicted on this charge, which they pled guilty to, with Robert Walzer getting the max sentence of 20 years, and Fred Stine getting a max sentence of 30 years. It was noted the only time Stine was seen to show any emotion. Through teary eyes, he asked, after his conviction, if he could get out earlier, if he exhibited good behavior in prison. And granted, he was set to be almost 80 years old by the time of his release, but still, even this showed how selfish this man was. Almost 50 times, as far as anyone knew, he intentionally set fires, any one of them having the potential to become a massive tragedy. Walzer just sat, staring forward when he received his sentence. That was it. They didn't need to be charged on anything else. They were both going away for a long time, but not quite yet. Walzer was so quick to admit to a succession of fires, which included admitting to 24 in Portland over the telephone to authorities back in the Rose City, that authorities in Tacoma figured there just might be more. If they put the squeeze on Walzer in particular a little more, who knew what might fall out? And it wasn't only fires in Portland he admitted to, in terms of Oregon-based conflagrations. There were a few others in the state. As a matter of fact, because this keeps being a thing with videos I do, there's a connection between this story and another bit of history I just recently covered. In covering the history of August Erickson and his famous Portland saloon, I briefly mentioned that he also established a place in Astoria, Oregon called the Louvre. Well, the building that once housed this establishment would end up being torched on September 21st, 1939. And who do you think was responsible for that fire? John Coluris, who ran a restaurant by the Louvre, was trying to remove equipment from his place in case it burned as well, and recalled several people helping him, two of which, as he would later find out, were Robert Walzer and Fred Stine. They helped him move stuff out and later helped him move it back in. And he wasn't simply mistaken, as others in the area saw them there as well. That's how deep the twisted nature of these two men was. There was little doubt they enjoyed these fires, often staying around to watch them as long as they could, but in this case they almost acted heroic in the face of a disaster they created. Talk about hanging out at the scene of the crime. Their system was simple. While using train cars to start blazes, they also used them to get around, thus spending time at or going between places that had direct railroad access. When they needed money, they committed robberies, sometimes robberies related to their fires, or they would roll drunks, meaning they sought out people who would get so wasted that they were either totally incoherent or passed out, and then they'd rob them. Lots of places were looking at these men for unsolved fires. The town of Hood River had multiple unsolved fires dating back to 1937. In Portland, a fire had been set at Jefferson High School in 1939, another one that had yet to be resolved. And even a massive fire on the Irving Dock, down by the Willamette River on October 28, 1938, was considered to possibly be the work of these two men. And later on, Walzer would take credit for this fire, and it would be reported in papers that they were also responsible for that one. However, someone had already taken credit for and been charged for that crime. About 3 weeks after this fire, a man named Raleigh Edison Morgan was arrested after confessing to starting the fire in order to disprove the efficacy of an automated fire and burglary alarm that had been placed there, an alarm that led to him being fired as a watchman. It not only turned out he was actually fired for showing up to work drunk, but he'd actually set 3 other fires on the dock in the past so that he could show his skills as a watchman by finding and reporting these fires quickly. He admitted to setting the fires using oily waste obtained from boxcars, similar to how our boys up in Tacoma did things. Granted, this was hardly an unheard of method to set fires back in this time. This gets at the heart of what is a possible issue in all cases such as these. Despite the prominence of what these two men did in their time, the story of these two firebugs has not been well documented since. It seems they've mostly been forgotten, and yet their fire count would rise exponentially. First, it would boom to more than 120 fires in total. And in the years to follow, it would be said they were responsible for as many as 247 fires. That could be just an exaggerated figure itself, but the fact of the matter was, over time, Walzer in particular continued to admit to other fires. So many fires, he stopped remembering where most of them happened. This could have been just a thing of convenience. He starts making up fires to pad his numbers, and that way he can achieve some kind of twisted arsonist infamy. He wouldn't be the first. He was already serving a 20-year sentence and going to be away for a long time, and it did not seem admitting to more fires affected that in any negative way. The fact of the matter is, we have no idea how many fires these two men actually started. It's somewhere between probably around 50 to almost 250. But the Irving Dock fire also proves Walzer was taking credit for fires he did not set. Perhaps he'd heard about it because it was a large fire and just hadn't heard that another firebug had already confessed to it, so he took credit. And while originally their fires were restricted to the Pacific Northwest, almost 30 in Oregon, 20 in Washington, and a few admitted in Idaho, after further investigation and interrogation, come early December 1939, Walzer changed his confession completely, albeit this was after his Chehalis fire conviction. Not only would his combined admitted fire count more than double, up to 125 fires, but he admitted that they'd set fires in 20 different states, mainly in the western half of the United States. These other states included California, Montana, Nevada, Utah, Wyoming, Colorado, Texas, Oklahoma, Kansas, Nebraska, North and South Dakota, Missouri, Minnesota, and Illinois. Again, whether or not this was true is hard to say. Walzer couldn't remember the specific locations of many of these other fires. He would also claim the first of these fires they set happened in Fargo, North Dakota back in 1936. But that wasn't the end, as with time that number continued to grow. I cannot say whether Walzer admitted to more fires or if an inaccurate, possibly exaggerated number was given to make the story pop, probably the latter of those two. But in a 1944 Oregonian article talking about this fire, it said that these sex-crazed pyromaniacs set fire to some 200 buildings, implying they set at least 200 fires. And when a 1946 article was published on the now old story, it was printed that they admitted to 247 fires. Probably a major exaggeration, since even after being kept for a month after his arrest before finally going to prison, they only got Walzer to admit to about half that many. Another angle could be that even after Walzer and Stine went away to prison, cities all over the West and Midwest were looking at unsolved fires that could have possibly been the work of these two. Even local Portland authorities said that any other fires in the area from that period in the late 30s that were unsolved and set using the same method that Walzer and Stine used could just be tied to them. So it's definitely possible this inflated 247 figure may be related to several towns in several states clearing unsolved arson cases just because they matched the modus operandi of these two firebugs. And again, using oily waste from train cars was a method other arsonists used at this time, so this was hardly a reliable way to clear open arson cases. Whatever the true figure was, a number there's no way we'll ever know, these guys should have gone down in infamy. They should be mentioned in any reflective piece related to arson and the Pacific Northwest, and yet even by the 50s, these two were totally forgotten. Had more of their fires achieved massive destruction, they may have been better remembered, but even more than that, had the worst of their fires been in places like Seattle or Portland, or even in the Bay Area rather than places like Butte, Montana and Chehalis, Washington, they most certainly would have been better remembered. So it's been a while since I've just walked around and reflected in relation to whatever the story is that I'm covering. And I'd show video as well, but I forget the time of the year that it is now, so it's really wet, it's really rainy, and it's almost dark outside, which technically coincides with the story I'm telling, since these two arsonists, they love to do their work at night. But not too late at night. They actually liked to make sure that they got it done by 9 p.m. usually. Sometimes they did it in the middle of the night, probably just when the mood striked. But they would sometimes, or for the most part, they would focus on setting their fires before it got too late so that they could actually get off the streets and go into hiding. They didn't want to get caught in the immediate aftermath of one of these fires for being out after hours or, being busted for vagrancy. They did look like tramps. So the last thing they wanted was to get in trouble right after they set a fire. And so that was a big thing for them. But I just wanted to reflect in general on the really two key things. And those key things were, they almost kind of counter each other, but I wanted to discuss the circumstances by which these two men likely did all of these fires, in particular that happened in the Portland area. That was the area that by far got hit the most, even though they set a lot of fires in Washington. They were kind of spread around, but in terms of the Portland area, that was more than 20 of the fires that they did. So I wanted to reflect a little bit on how they probably would have gone about doing that, considering just when these events happened, but also kind of contemplating, were they really responsible for all these fires? And were they really responsible for even remotely as many fires
as they claimed they did, and that's critical when you're talking about a story that starts in mystery. All these fires are happening and nobody knows where they're coming from. And then a couple of guys come along and all of a sudden one of them takes credit for some, and then the number of fires he takes credit for just keeps climbing. And it's convenient to investigators, but it's also suspicious. And so in relation to the Portland fires, it seems they happened in 3 bursts. They started early November, if you believe they didn't cause the Irving dock fire that, again, somebody else took credit for. The first rush of fires starts early November 1938 and trails off at the end of December. And these firebugs aren't seen for all of January, and then suddenly they're back start of February into the start of March. String of fires. There was like 6 of them in an 8-day period. And then suddenly there's no fires for like 4.5 months. And the only fire that they took credit for over a period of beginning of March 1939 all the way into late August of that year was this fire that they built by the tunnel in Mock's Crest, which I actually visited that spot way back when I was like a new YouTuber, so I actually had some video of it. But even that fire, it was even acknowledged in newspapers that the information available was extremely vague. It's almost like they couldn't fully prove that the fire happened, even though there's a general description given that combustibles were found near the tunnel. But that's the only fire tied to them. It's like the most questionable of the bunch in terms of information known. And it's the only one that happens in this period of time. Then they come back, set a couple fires between late August into September into October. And then early November, they're apprehended in Tacoma, and we know even in late October that's where they were. So the obvious explanation for this is not that I think that these guys, they would get excited, set a bunch of fires, and then the charm would fade off and they would have to have a resting period and then come back, and start setting fires again. I think it's just a matter of the fact that they were traveling around and they were known to frequent Tacoma, Washington in particular over and over again. So these guys, for the better part of 1938 and 1939, were just bobbing back and forth between Oregon and Washington. It may have been just they wanted to just keep moving, hit this spot, hit that spot, travel over here, hit some spots. It could also be that maybe when they felt maybe the heat was getting a little close, they decided, let's relocate for a while. We can come back whenever we want, as long as they don't know who we are. An individual that was likely Robert Walzer was seen running from the vicinity of the Honey Pacific fire, and not too long after that the fires stopped for a while. So could it be that he was seen, he spoke to a guy, he got a little nervous, he was like, hey Fred, someone may be able to identify me, and they were like, well, let's split town, head up into Washington for a while. So they were obviously cycling back and forth, and maybe they headed into Ohio during this, Idaho during this time. They could have headed down into California. At one point during his confessions, Walzer said that they had set multiple fires down in the San Francisco, Oakland Bay area. Anywhere from 10 to 30 fires is what I read, so I don't know how reliable that information is, but that seems to be the most likely thing that was going on. That is, of course, under the presumption that these two guys were responsible for all these fires, because they took credit for at least some that they didn't do. And the numbers just kept growing over time. But it's entirely possible that, again, a lot of this was just primarily Robert Walzer trying to maybe achieve a little infamy for himself. He's young, he's lost in life. This gives him some kind of purpose, even though it's not a great one. Even Fred Stine, who resisted for a long time admitting to any more than just one fire, the one in Chehalis, reportedly he eventually admitted to being involved in 90 fires. So, I mean, these guys definitely were firebugs, pyromaniacs, whatever you want to call them. They were definitely setting a lot of fires, in particular in the Pacific Northwest. However, again, most of the fires that these guys took credit for in places outside of the Pacific Northwest, all through the, going all the way as far east as Illinois, these were ones that Walzer himself admitted to, but he couldn't really remember where a lot of them were set. So if you just say, oh yeah, I set fires in this state, that state, and this state, well, where did you set them? I don't really remember. We were traveling around a lot. There's no verification there. And also, in relation to all these Portland cases, now it's very possible that they were responsible for all of these fires from November, early November, if you exclude the Irving Dock one, early November 1938 into October 1939. There were slight variations in how these fires were done, but they weren't extreme. Not all of them involved the use of oily waste obtained from boxcars. That doesn't necessarily mean they weren't also responsible for those fires too. But the way that Walzer took credit for all of these Portland fires, which again, obviously, me being who I am, and the majority of what these guys did, the worst of what they did was in Portland. That's my focus, is the Portland cases. Well, the way that Walzer took credit for all these Portland murders is he got on the phone with someone back in the city and over the phone took credit for these crimes. And so what I think happens, Walzer gets on the phone with this authority figure back in Portland. They got all of these unsolved fires that have happened in the city, and they just start getting listed off one by one. Western Foundry, Oregon Door, Pacific Honey, Honey Press, so on and so forth. Like, this one, did you do that? This one, did you do that? And then Walzer can respond. Now, that may be a fast way to get somebody to admit to committing a bunch of crimes, and time-wise it may be effective, but what you're telling this guy in that moment is, hey, a fire happened here. Hey, a fire happened there. He's giving this guy the information. So even if Walzer has no idea that this fire happened here, that fire happened there, he's being given the information, and all he has to do is say, yes, I did that. Yes, I did that. Yes, I did this. Yes, I did that. And he can take credit for fires that he didn't even know happened. And the city's satisfied. Now, I mention this because this is likely how a lot of other places dealt with the situation. Talk to Walzer, see which crimes he'll admit to, because at the same time, this guy had to have some incentive to admit to doing a bunch more fires. I don't think they didn't do any, and he just had a wish to be in prison for the rest of his life. I just think he got a little out of hand, maybe with the total count, and maybe he was totally right and honest when he said they did a couple hundred fires, apparently. So I by no means am claiming that because he had potential fires literally said to him so he could take credit for things easily that way, I'm by no means saying that means he didn't do any of these fires. I'm just saying it could have opened the door to him to admit to a lot of fires they had done, and possibly a few they didn't. And if other parts of the country had conversed with Walzer in this same way, calling him, hey, we have these unsolved fires. Did you do this one? Did you do that one? That opens the door from several other places for this man to take credit for all of these fires. And all of a sudden it becomes real easy for this guy to say, oh, I did 47 fires. No, wait, I did 125. Wait, I think it was upwards of 200. You know what? It may have been closer to 250. And everyone's satisfied because these towns are clearing up these unsolved fire cases. You know, at the end of the day, that's a big deal. These towns, they don't want all this unsolved stuff on their books. It's this constant headache that lingers around. It angers the locals. Why have you not solved this? There's still a firebug on the loose. It helps you clear cases, whether you have evidence to or not, and it also calms your local populace, for the most part, you know, outside of the ones that are suspicious about how this is all being done. But the general populace is satisfied that the individual responsible has been apprehended. No worries, people. They were caught. You have nothing to worry about. So, I personally don't believe that these guys were responsible for upwards of 250 fires, but somewhere between 50 and 100, I think, is definitely possible, if not probable. These were absolute firebugs, but in this massive, this is a pretty significant piece of Portland history that never gets talked about anymore. So many fires potentially started by the same two people in one city over a certain period of time. It's a massive story, and it's a story that, as far as everyone is concerned, has been solved. These guys took credit. All these fires were the work of these two men, and yet there is just a little room for doubt. Again, not that they didn't do any of these fires, but that there may be some fires that they took credit for that somebody else did. Again, their method of operation was not a rare one. The guy that confessed to doing the Irving Dock fire, he set his fires the same way. So there may at least be a handful of these Portland fires that, on the books, are considered solved. But in reality, granted we'll never know, in reality, they're still unsolved. It would come up during the investigation that Fred Stine's real name was George Francis. This was only mentioned in a few articles, and there is potential proof that this was an error. Perhaps Francis was his real alias. I say this because Fred Stine would pass away while still in prison in Walla Walla on May 6, 1954 at the age of 62. His death certificate lists him as Fred Stine, and even lists his father's name as Sylvester Stine. The cause of death was coronary thrombosis, a blood clot. Robert Walzer was a little harder to track till I found a Robert Harris Walzer on Ancestry.com who was born in New York in 1917, just like our Walzer. This particular Walzer died on July 30th, 1984, at the age of 67 while living in Troy, New York. Both men were still at Walla Walla into the 1950s, but I found a picture from December 4th, 1954, showing two men, one of whom was a Robert H. Walzer, doing work around Christmas time for the Salvation Army. Not only do the names match, but this picture was published in the Rome Daily Sentinel, the newspaper for the specific New York town where our Robert Walzer was born in and grew up in. What are the odds? In fact, interesting brief side note, Robert Walzer was actually born in Rochester, just like Fred Stine, and yet they found each other miraculously many years later in a small town in Montana. I also found a March 1970 piece regarding the death of Walzer's mother, where her son, Robert H. Walzer, is referenced, and referenced as living in Troy, the same town where a man of the same name would die in 1984. So this is, no doubt, our guy. So we can see he was released early, and obviously just went back home where it seems he was at least doing some good. I found nothing to suggest he
kept getting in trouble or got mixed up in arson fires again. Perhaps he was right then when he claimed that Fred Stine was the leader, the instigator. He was young and lost and angry at the world, but probably young enough to pull himself out of that. Even when he was arrested back in 1939, he told authorities, "I'm sorry, and I think we ought to get the full limits. We did not think anyone might get hurt, and I wouldn't like to see that happen." Not the most motivating example of remorse, but unlike Stine, who maintained denials of more than one fire for some time, Walzer was quick to acknowledge what he had done and openly state he deserved the maximum punishment for what he did. So, of course, in the end, he got the shorter sentence and was released early. Ain't that how it always goes?